The woman they bought was the one nobody else wanted. She was the last lot of the day, an orc with 2 children, brought to the indenture block after the fine horses and the bonded labourers with specific trades had already been claimed. The woman they bought was the one who, when the auctioneer's gaze swept over her, had looked back, not with defiance, but with an emptiness so profound it swallowed the light. He saw it from the back of the sparse crowd, standing under the grey overhang of the provisioner's roof. He saw the way she held her children behind her, a small, still mountain against the tide of indifference. The boy, maybe 8 years old, stared at the mud-caked boots of the men in the front row. The girl, no older than 5, had her face buried in the coarse fabric of her mother's tunic. They were selling a family for parts, and no one was bidding. He waited until the auctioneer's call grew strained, until the silence became a form of cruelty in itself, and then he raised one hand. Just once. His was the only bid. The rain had begun as they left the town square, a cold, persistent autumn drizzle that clung to the air and turned the world the colour of slate. The orc woman, Graka, the indenture papers called her, walked a few paces behind him. She did not speak. She did not look at him. Her gaze was fixed on the heels of her children, who trudged along, their small shoulders slumped under the weight of a day that had taken everything from them. He carried their only bundle, a pathetic roll of blankets that smelled of wood smoke and damp earth. He was Silas, a name he had not offered, a name she had not asked for. To her, he was just the man who had bought her silence, her labour, her children's future, for the price of 3 silver marks. A bargain, someone in the crowd had muttered. A burden, another had corrected. They walked for nearly an hour, leaving the last of the town's smoky lanterns behind them, following a path that narrowed as the forest closed in. The air grew sharp with the scent of pine resin and wet soil. He could feel her presence behind him, a steady, wary weight. He knew what she was expecting. He had seen it in the faces of other bonded orcs in the logging camps to the north. A resignation to the worst of human nature, a bracing for the casual cruelty that was so often the currency of these transactions. He stopped at the edge of a small clearing where a cabin sat hunkered against the hillside, a single thread of smoke rising from its stone chimney into the darkening sky. A place of deep, inviolable quiet. "This is it," he said, his voice rough from disuse. She said nothing. Her eyes scanned the cabin, the neat stacks of firewood under the eaves, the dark, unblinking windows. She was assessing threats, calculating escape routes. Her body was a fortress, and her children were the treasure locked inside. He saw the tension in her jaw, the way her hand rested on her son's shoulder, a silent promise of protection she no longer had the power to grant. By the way, wherever in the world you're listening from right now, drop it in the comments. I genuinely love seeing how far these stories travel. Okay, where were we? He pushed the heavy wooden door open, revealing a single room bathed in the warm, flickering light of a hearth fire. It was a simple space, but clean. A large table, 2 chairs, a bed built into one wall, and another, smaller rocking chair that sat strangely empty beside the fire, a hand-woven shawl draped over its back. The air inside smelled of wood smoke, dried herbs, and something else. Loneliness. It was the smell of a place where a life had been lived and then had stopped. Graka hesitated at the threshold, one hand on the doorframe, as if the warmth within was a trap she was wise enough to distrust. Her children pressed close against her legs, peering into the light. Silas stepped aside, leaving the way clear. He did not invite her in. He simply made room. After a long moment, a silence stretched thin by the sound of the rain and the crackle of the fire, she took a single step, and then another, crossing the threshold from the cold dark into the hesitant light. She did not look at him. She looked at the empty chair by the fire, and for the first time since he had seen her on the block, her expression flickered with something other than exhausted resolve. It was a brief, sharp pang of recognition, the way one survivor recognizes another. He let the quiet settle, giving her time to map the geography of the room. He walked over to the hearth and added a log to the fire, the sparks dancing up the chimney. He felt her watching his hands, his movements. He was a large man, but he moved with a woodsman's economy, no wasted motion, no sudden gestures. He had learned long ago that quiet was a language all its own, and in the company of the wounded, it was the only one that could be trusted. "There's stew," he said, gesturing with his chin toward a black iron pot hanging over the flames. "And bread." Graka's gaze followed his, landing on the pot. Her children, who had been silent statues at her side, seemed to come alive at the mention of food. The little girl, Liri, let out a small, hopeful sound, quickly muffled against her mother's leg. The boy, Zor, simply watched the pot, his young face a mask of desperate hunger. Graka's own expression remained unchanged, but a muscle in her jaw tightened. To accept food was to accept a debt. To accept kindness was to accept a vulnerability she could not afford. Silas understood this. He turned his back to them, busying himself with setting 3 bowls on the heavy oak table. They were mismatched earthenware, chipped and worn. He ladled the thick rabbit stew into each one, the steam rising in fragrant clouds. He cut 3 thick slices from a dark loaf of bread and placed them beside the bowls. Then he sat down in one of the 2 chairs, leaving the other for her. He did not command her to eat. He did not tell her to sit. He simply began to eat his own meal, slowly, methodically. An offering, not an order. It was the boy who broke first. Zor moved away from his mother's side, his small legs carrying him to the table. He stood there for a moment, his eyes fixed on the bowl, before looking back at his mother. It was a question and a plea. Graka's gaze softened for an instant. She gave a short, almost imperceptible nod. The boy scrambled onto the bench beside the table and began to eat, his hands clumsy with hunger, scooping the hot stew into his mouth with a wooden spoon that was too big for him. The little girl followed, climbing up beside her brother, her own small face a picture of pure, unadulterated relief. Only then did Graka move. She walked to the table and took the remaining chair, positioning herself so she could see both her children and the door. She picked up her spoon but did not eat. She watched Silas. He continued to eat his stew, his eyes on his own bowl. He was not looking at her, not studying her. he was simply existing in the same space, sharing the same meal. Finally, she dipped her spoon into the stew. It was rich with root vegetables and savory meat. It was the first truly hot meal she had eaten in 3 weeks. She ate slowly, her posture ramrod straight, as if expecting the food to be snatched away at any moment. When they were all finished, the bowls wiped clean with the last of the bread, a heavy silence fell over the room again. The only sounds were the hiss of the fire and the steady drumming of the rain on the roof. The children's heads were beginning to nod, their bellies full, the warmth of the cabin seeping into their bones. Silas rose from the table and went to a large wooden chest at the foot of his bed. He pulled out 2 thick wool blankets and a pair of straw-stuffed sleeping pallets. He laid them on the floor near the hearth in the warmest part of the room. "This is for you," he said, his voice low. "For you and the children." Graccha stared at the pallets, at the blankets. Just shelter, just warmth. They were the simplest of comforts, yet they felt like an impossible luxury. "The work," she said, her voice a low rasp, the first words she had spoken to him. "What is the work?" Silas turned to face her. He held the indenture contract in his hand, the one the town clerk had stamped. It gave him ownership of her labour for 5 years. It gave him rights. He looked at the document, then at her. He saw the faint, silvery trace of an old scar that cut across her left eyebrow. He saw the weariness etched into the lines around her eyes. He saw a person, not a contract. "The contract is for firewood," he said, his voice even and plain. "I have a cordwood agreement with the town. I cut, you help me split and stack. When the debt is paid, the contract is done." She blinked. "The debt? 3 silver marks?" "That's the price," he confirmed. Her mind worked quickly. An orc could split and stack a cord of wood in a week, maybe less. Even with the inflated prices the town charged for supplies, 3 silver marks was not 5 years of labour. It was a month, 2 at the most. She stared at him, searching for the lie, the hidden clause, the cruelty lurking beneath the surface of this strange, quiet man. "You paid the price," she stated, her voice flat. "The contract says 5 years. He walked over to the fire and held the edge of the paper to the flames. It caught immediately, the dry parchment curling and blackening, the official script of the prefect turning to ash. He dropped it into the hearth and watched it burn until nothing was left. "The contract was to get you out of the square," he said, turning back to her. He met her gaze directly, his own eyes a clear, steady grey. "We'll keep a ledger. You'll see the numbers yourself. When the 3 marks are worked off, you're free to go. Or to stay. Your choice." He paused, letting the words settle in the quiet room. "I just needed help with the wood. My wife, she used to help me." He glanced at the empty rocking chair, and for a moment the mask of stoicism slipped, revealing a grief so deep and abiding it seemed to have become part of the very grain of the cabin's wooden walls. He looked away, back at the fire. Graccha followed his gaze to the chair, to the shawl. She understood. This wasn't a trap. It was something far more complicated. It was a home haunted by a ghost, and this man had just invited 3 more into it. She looked at her children, now fast asleep on the warm floor by the fire, their faces peaceful for the first time in months. She looked at this quiet man and his quiet grief, and for the first time, she allowed herself to feel a flicker of something other than fear. It was not hope. It was not trust. It was simply stillness. A momentary pause in a life that had been nothing but a desperate forward flight. The next morning, Graka woke before the sun. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, and the cabin was filled with a pre-dawn chill. Silas was already gone. A fresh stack of firewood sat by the hearth, and the water bucket was full. On the table, another loaf of bread and a small wheel of cheese were laid out. There was no note, no instruction, just a quiet provision for their needs. She moved with a practiced silence, stoking the fire back to life, her movements economical and sure. Her children were still asleep, huddled together under the thick wool blankets. She watched them for a moment, the fierce protective love she felt for them, a physical ache in her chest. Everything she did, every humiliation she had endured, was for them, to keep them safe, to keep them fed, to keep them together. When she stepped outside, the air was crisp and cold, smelling of damp earth and frost. The rain had stopped, and a pale, watery light was filtering through the dense canopy of pine and fir. Silas was in the clearing, his back to her. He stood before a massive log, his axe resting beside him. He was sharpening a set of iron wedges, the rhythmic scrape of stone against metal, the only sound in the morning quiet. He did not turn as she approached, but she knew he was aware of her. "The maul is there," he said, nodding toward a long-handled splitting maul leaning against the woodpile. "And another axe, if you prefer it." She walked over and picked up the maul. It was heavy, the handle worn smooth from use. It was a good tool, well balanced. She ran her hand over the iron head, testing its weight. She had done this work before. In her own village, before the skirmishes, before her mate was killed, before her life had unravelled, splitting wood was a communal task, a preparation for the long, cold winters. It was honest work. She took her stance before a smaller, more manageable log, planting her feet wide. She raised the maul high over her head, her powerful shoulders bunching. The first swing was a test, a way to feel the grain of the wood, to find its weakness. The maul struck dead center with a resonant thwack, sinking deep. The second swing split the log clean in two. She did not pause. She set up another piece and swung again, and again, a steady, powerful rhythm. Thwack, crack, thwack, crack. Silas stopped sharpening his wedges and watched her. He had seen men half her size struggle with logs like these. She worked with a fluid efficiency that spoke of long practice. There was no wasted energy, no hesitation. She was strong, yes, but it was more than that. There was a dignity in her labor, a focus that seemed to block out the rest of the world. He saw the way her hands, scarred and calloused, gripped the handle of the maul. They were not the hands of a victim. They were the hands of a survivor. They were hands that had built and mended and fought and protected. He picked up his own axe and turned back to the larger log, the one too big for a single person to split. He began to cut notches for the wedges, his own movements falling into a rhythm that complemented hers. They worked in silence for over an hour as the sun rose higher, casting long shadows across the clearing. The pile of split wood grew steadily beside them. The children emerged from the cabin, rubbing the sleep from their eyes. They stood on the porch, watching the two adults work. Zor, the older boy, had his mother's watchful eyes. He assessed Silas, his axe, the growing woodpile. He was weighing the man, trying to understand his place in their precarious new reality. Liri, the little girl, was less guarded. She was fascinated by the rhythmic sounds, the dance of labour between her mother and the quiet man. After a while, Zor walked down the steps and began to gather the smaller pieces of split wood, the kindling. He stacked them in his arms and carried them to the woodpile, creating his own small, neat stack next to the larger one. He did not ask for permission. He simply saw a job that needed doing and did it. Silas paused, leaning on his axe, and watched the boy. Zor worked with a solemn determination, his small face serious. "That's a good stack, son," Silas said, his voice quiet. Zor froze, his arms full of wood. He looked up at Silas, surprised to be addressed. He glanced at his mother, who had also paused in her work. Graka's expression was unreadable. "It needs to be tight," Zor said, his voice small but firm, "so the snow doesn't get in." "You're right about that," Silas said with a nod. He turned back to his log and drove a wedge into the notch with a sharp blow from his hammer. The wood groaned in protest. Graka watched the exchange, a flicker of something new in her eyes. It was not trust. It was something smaller, more fragile. It was the simple recognition that this man saw her son not as a piece of property, but as a boy with knowledge, a boy with worth. She hefted the maul again, the weight of it feeling a little less like a burden and a little more like a tool. They worked until midday, when Silas called a halt. He went inside and returned with bread, cheese, and a water skin, which they shared sitting on a log, the sweat cooling on their skin. The children sat with them, eating their share in a comfortable silence. The initial tension of the morning had eased, replaced by the simple camaraderie of shared labour. "You handle a mole well," Silas said, his gaze on the woodpile. It was not a compliment meant to flatter, it was a simple statement of fact. Graka looked down at her hands. "My mate taught me. He said the wood tells you where to strike. You just have to listen." It was the first time she had mentioned her past, her family. The words hung in the air between them, a small, tentative bridge across the chasm of their different worlds. Silas simply nodded, accepting the information without prying. He understood that grief, like wood, had its own grain, its own lines of weakness. You couldn't force it. You had to listen. Later that afternoon, while Silas was reshoeing his mule, Graka took the mending basket she found by the hearth. Inside was a collection of Silas's work clothes, torn and frayed. A shirt was missing 2 buttons, and a pair of trousers had a rip in the knee. The thread and needles were of good quality. She sat on the cabin steps, the autumn sun warm on her back, and began to sew. Her stitches were small and even, a neat, disciplined line that pulled the torn fabric back together. Her children played nearby. Liri had discovered a patch of late-blooming mountain daisies and was carefully weaving them into a chain. Zor was attempting to carve a piece of scrap wood with a small, dull knife he must have found. He was trying to make a bird, but it looked more like a lopsided fish. When Silas finished with the mule, he walked over, his movements slow so as not to startle them. He stopped a few feet away, watching Graka's hands as she worked the needle. The patch she was sewing over the torn knee was almost invisible, the stitches so fine they blended into the weave of the fabric. He looked at the shirt beside her, where 2 new buttons, carved from a piece of antler, had been securely fastened. He had lived alone for 3 years, since his Alara had died. In that time, his life had become a series of functional routines. He cooked, he cleaned, he worked. But his clothes were frayed, his meals were simple, his cabin was silent. He had survived, but he had not been living. Now, watching this quiet orc woman mend his clothes while her daughter wove flowers and her son tried to carve a bird, he felt a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the sun. It was the feeling of a house slowly, hesitantly, becoming a home again. Graka finished her stitch and bit the thread. She looked up and found him watching her. She immediately flinched, her reflexive apology already forming on her lips. She had overstepped, used his things without asking. The basket was there, she began, her voice low. I can undo it. No, he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. It's good work, better than I could do. He looked at the neatly repaired trousers. Thank you. The words were simple, but they landed with the force of a revelation. In the past year, under the thumb of Prefect Valerius, she had been given only orders. Her work had been taken, not received. Her efforts had been measured in demerits, not gratitude. To be thanked for a simple act of mending felt foreign, unsettling. A small, hesitant smile touched the corner of her mouth. It was a fragile thing, barely there, but it transformed her face, softening the harsh lines of weariness and grief. It was the first time Silas had seen her smile, and in that moment, he felt the frozen ground of his own heart begin to thaw, just a little. He thought of the empty rocking chair by the fire, a monument to what he had lost. For the first time, he wondered if a heart could heal not by forgetting, but by making room for what grew beside the old roots. The thought was so unexpected it almost made him stumble. He simply gave her a small nod and went back to his work, leaving the smile to fade back into her usual quiet composure. But something had shifted. A seed of trust, small and fragile, had been planted in the hard soil of their shared silence. Weeks turned into a month. A routine settled over the cabin, as natural and unspoken as the changing of the leaves. Each morning, Silas and Graka worked in the clearing, the pile of cordwood growing into a small mountain that promised warmth against the coming winter. Zor continued his self-appointed task of stacking kindling, his piles becoming more and more elaborate. Liri, too young for heavy work, would gather fallen pine cones and colourful leaves, creating intricate patterns on the porch steps, her quiet humming a constant, gentle melody in the background. The silence in the cabin was no longer heavy with grief and suspicion. It was a comfortable quiet, punctuated by the sounds of a household. The bubble of stew in the pot, the scratch of Zor's charcoal on a piece of slate as Silas taught him his letters, the soft thud of Graccha's needle moving through cloth. She had taken it upon herself to mend everything, the blankets, the grain sacks, even the leather straps of Silas's pack. It was her way of contributing, of balancing the ledger he kept meticulously on the wall. Every evening, after the simple meal, Silas would take out a block of wood and his carving knife. He would sit in his usual chair, the empty rocking chair beside him a silent companion, and carve. He was working on a small, detailed figure of a wolf, its head tilted as if listening. The children would watch, mesmerized, as the creature emerged from the wood under his skilled hands. One evening, Liri, emboldened by weeks of quiet kindness, crept over to his side. She pointed a small finger at the empty rocking chair. "Who sits there?" she asked, her voice clear in the quiet room. Graccha stiffened. Zor shot his sister a warning look. It was a question no one had dared to ask. Silas stopped carving. He looked at the chair, his expression unreadable in the firelight. He ran a hand over the smooth, worn wood of its arm. "My wife," he said, his voice low and steady. "Her name was Elara. She liked to sit here and knit. She made that shawl." He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. The simple statement filled the room with her presence. Graccha looked at the chair not as an empty space, but as a space that was filled with memory. She saw for the first time the true depth of this man's loss. It was not a wound that had scarred over. It was a constant, living absence. "She would have liked your flowers," Silas said, his gaze shifting to Liri. Liri beamed, a wide, gap-toothed smile. She scurried back to her mother's side, satisfied. The tension in the room broke. Zor went back to his slate, and Graccha resumed her mending. But the air had changed. A ghost had been named, and in the naming had become less a spectre and more a gentle memory, a part of the history of the house they now shared. As the first snows began to dust the high peaks, Silas announced he needed to go into town for supplies. It was a 2-day trip. He packed the mule with the first cords of split firewood to sell. "You'll be all right here?" he asked, looking at Graccha. It was not a question of her competence, but of her comfort. She nodded. "We will." She felt a strange pang of apprehension as he left, a feeling she hadn't expected. In a few short weeks, his steady, quiet presence had become a source of stability, a wall against the hostile world she had fled. The cabin felt too quiet without him, the silence once again echoing with loneliness rather than peace. That night, a storm blew in from the north, a furious onslaught of wind and snow. The cabin groaned under the assault. Graccha kept the fire roaring, its light a warm, defiant beacon against the raging dark. The children slept soundly, accustomed to the safety of the small home. But Graccha lay awake, listening to the wind howl. It sounded like the world was trying to tear their fragile shelter apart. In the middle of the night, a loud crash from outside jolted her upright. She grabbed the spare axe, her heart pounding. She moved to the window, peering through a small gap in the wooden shutters. In a flash of lightning, she saw it. A massive pine tree at the edge of the clearing had been struck, a huge branch torn from its trunk. It had fallen directly onto the corner of the small barn where Sinus kept his mule and their winter stores of dried meat and grain. She didn't hesitate. She pulled on her boots and a heavy cloak. "Stay inside," she told Zor, who had woken at the noise. "Keep the door barred. Don't open it for anyone." He nodded, his young face pale but resolute. He was his mother's son. She plunged into the blizzard, the wind tearing at her cloak, the snow blinding her. The fallen branch was immense, a tangled mess of wood and needles that had crushed a section of the barn roof. She could hear the mule inside braying in terror. The main door was blocked. She had to find another way in. Working by instinct in the swirling snow, she used the axe to hack at the weaker planks of the back wall, creating a hole just large enough to squeeze through. Inside, the terrified mule was pulling at its tether, its eyes wide with panic. The roof above it was groaning, threatening to collapse completely under the weight of the branch and the accumulating snow. She spoke to the animal in a low, soothing voice, the old orcish words soft and calming. She moved slowly, letting it get used to her presence. She managed to cut its tether, and with a firm hand on its halter, she led the trembling animal through the hole she had made and out into the relative safety of the clearing. But the stores were still inside, their winter food, Silas's livelihood. She went back into the groaning structure. The main support beam above the grain sacks was cracked, splintered down the middle. It wouldn't hold for long. With a strength born of desperation, she began hauling the heavy sacks of grain and flour out through the hole, one by one, dragging them through the deepening snow and into the cabin. She worked until her muscles screamed and her lungs burned from the cold air. She managed to save all of it, the grain, the flour, the salted meat, the barrels of dried apples. Just as she dragged the last sack clear, the cracked beam gave way with a deafening roar. The rest of the roof collapsed, burying the interior of the barn in a heap of splintered wood and snow. She stood, panting, covered in snow, watching the ruin. She had saved the food. They would survive the winter. That was all that mattered. When Silas returned 2 days later, he found a scene of devastation. The great pine branch lay across the flattened remains of his barn. The world was covered in a thick blanket of white. His heart sank. He had lost everything. But then he saw the neat stacks of grain sacks and barrels piled on the cabin porch, covered with a tarp. He saw his mule, safe and calm in a makeshift lean-to Gracca had built against the side of the cabin. And when he opened the door, he was met with the smell of baking bread and the sight of Gracca and her children, safe and warm by the fire. He stood in the doorway, covered in snow, taking in the scene. Gracca looked up at him, her face smudged with soot. "The roof beam was cracked," she said, her voice simple and direct, as if reporting on a routine chore. "I got the stores out." He looked from her to the children, to the warm, safe cabin. He looked at the ruin of his barn outside. He had left them for 2 days, and she had saved them. She had saved his winter, his future. He didn't have the words to express the gratitude, the sheer awe that filled him. He just nodded, his throat tight. He walked over to the fire and held his frozen hands out to the flames. He felt Graka's presence beside him. She handed him a cup of hot, spiced tea. Their fingers brushed as he took it. It was a small, accidental touch, but it sent a jolt of warmth through him that had nothing to do with the fire. In that moment, he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that this was no longer just his home. It was theirs. The roots of a new family were taking hold, quietly, stubbornly, in the frozen ground of their shared lives. One evening, as the winter winds howled outside and the cabin was filled with the comfortable quiet of their established life, Graka finally spoke of the past. It happened without ceremony. Silas was carving, the wolf nearly complete. The children were asleep on their pallets. Graka was darning one of Zora's socks, her hands moving with a steady, practiced rhythm. His name was Kale, she said into the silence. Silas didn't look up from his carving, but his hands stilled. He knew who she meant. He was a hunter, the best in our clan. Her voice was low, a monotone that betrayed no emotion, but the memories were there, living just beneath the surface. He was strong and kind. He taught Zor how to track, how to read the wind. He used to sing the old songs while he worked. She paused, her needle still. There was a border dispute, humans pushing into our lands for timber. There were skirmishes. Kale, he was killed in one of them. It was quick, they said. She fell silent for a long time. Silas waited, giving her the space to continue or to stop. The only sound was the crackle of the fire. After he died, she went on, her voice hardening slightly. Everything fell apart. Our clan was broken, scattered. There was no one left. I took the children and we travelled south looking for work. That's when we came to the prefect's district. Her gaze became distant, her eyes fixed on a past she was reliving. His name is Valerius, Prefect Valerius. He seemed helpful at first. He offered me a work bond to pay for our food and lodging. He said it was just a formality. She let out a short, bitter laugh. I couldn't read the human script. I signed with my thumbprint. The debt was small, but it never seemed to get smaller. He added charges for everything, a fee for the children's rations, a tax for living within the town walls, a fine if my work wasn't fast enough. Her hands tightened on the sock she was mending. He knew the townspeople feared orcs. He used it. He would speak to me in public, his voice so reasonable, explaining my obligations. He would praise my strength, my capacity for labor, as if I were a prize ox. He made a spectacle of my debt, of my otherness. It was a slow process, a quiet chipping away. He never laid a hand on me. He didn't have to. He used shame as a leash. Silas finally looked up, his grey eyes dark with a quiet anger. He had seen men like Valerius, men who wielded rules and respectability like a club, their cruelty hidden behind a veneer of civility. The final straw, Graca continued, her voice dropping to a near whisper, was when he told me Zor was old enough to be put to work in the mines. To pay off my debt faster, he said. He was going to separate us. I knew then that we had to run. We left in the middle of the night with nothing but the clothes on our backs. We were caught 2 weeks later, just outside this territory. They brought us to the indenture block, and you were there. She finished her story, and the silence that followed was profound. She had given him the gift of her truth, a heavy, painful thing. He saw her not just as the competent, resilient woman who had rebuilt his barn and mended his clothes, but as a person who had been systematically stripped of her dignity, her name, her future. "He will not find you here," Silas said. The words were a vow. "This is your home now, if you want it." Graca looked at him, really looked at him, her dark eyes searching his face. She saw no pity there, only a quiet, unshakable resolve. She gave a single, slow nod. The conversation was over. The truth was now shared between them, a foundation upon which their fragile trust could continue to build. But the world was smaller than they knew. A few weeks later, a travelling merchant passed through the town, a man who traded in news as much as in goods. He spoke of a prefect Valerius, a man of great importance from the next district, who was offering a substantial reward for the return of a runaway Orc bondswoman and her 2 children. A dangerous criminal, the prefect claimed, who had stolen from him before she fled. The news spread through the town like a winter sickness. The fear and prejudice that had lain dormant began to stir. People who had started to nod at Silas when he came for supplies now looked away. The whispers started. He was harbouring a fugitive. He was putting the town at risk. Silas knew it was only a matter of time. He went to see Elara Vance, the town magistrate. She was an old woman, sharp as a shard of flint, with a reputation for fairness that was only exceeded by her distrust of outside officials. She had known Silas since he was a boy, and had been fond of his wife. He found her in her small office, surrounded by dusty books and maps. He told her everything, just as Graca had told him. He didn't embellish or plead, he just stated the facts. Elara listened without interruption, her fingers steepled under her chin. When he was finished, she was silent for a long moment. "The law on indenture is a tangled mess, Silas," she said, her voice dry as old paper. "A contract signed is a contract binding, especially when it involves non-humans. This prefect Valerius will arrive with papers, with seals, with authority." Silas's jaw tightened. The contract was a lie. "I believe you," she said, her sharp eyes meeting his. "But belief is not proof. Valerius will perform his part on a public stage. He will be reasonable, lawful, concerned. He will paint this Graca as ungrateful, perhaps even violent. He will use your town's fear against you, and against her." "What can we do?" Silas asked. The magistrate leaned forward. "He wants a public stage? We will give him one. But the audience will be ours, and the final act will not be the one he has written." 3 days later, Prefect Valerius arrived. He rode into town on a fine black horse, flanked by 2 armed guards. He was exactly as Graca had described him, handsome, well-dressed, with a smile that was broad but did not reach his eyes. He went directly to the magistrate's office. Silas was waiting at the cabin when the summons came. A boy from the town, breathless from running, delivered the message. The prefect demanded the return of his property. A public hearing was to be held in the town square in 1 hour. Graka's face went pale. All the strength, all the resilience she had shown over the past months seemed to drain away, replaced by the old, familiar terror. "I have to run," she whispered, her eyes darting toward the forest. "I can take the children." Silas put a hand on her arm. His touch was firm, grounding. "No more running," he said, his voice low and certain. "You are not his property. This is your home. We will face him together." She looked at him, her breath catching in her throat. She had spent so long fighting alone, she had forgotten what it felt like to have someone stand beside her. Not in front of her, as a champion, but beside her, as an equal. "He will twist my words," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "He will make them believe." "Then you will speak the truth," Silas said simply, "and the truth will be enough." He looked at Zor and Liri, who were watching with wide, frightened eyes. He knelt down so he was at their level. "A bad man is in town," he said, his voice gentle but serious. "He is going to tell lies about your mother. But we are going to be there to tell the truth. All you have to do is stand with her and be brave. Can you do that?" Zor nodded, his small jaw set with a fierce determination that mirrored his mother's. Liri, her lower lip trembling, looked at her brother, then at Silas, and then she nodded too. Graka watched him speak to her children, and a wave of fierce, protective warmth washed over her. He was right. There would be no more running. She straightened her shoulders, the posture of the woman who had split a mountain of firewood and saved a winter's worth of food returning. "All right," she said, her voice steady now. "Let's go." They walked into town together, Silas and Graka side by side, the children holding their mother's hands. They were not a master and his bondswoman. They were a family. And they were walking into a fight. The town square was crowded. It seemed every person in the settlement had turned out, their faces a mixture of curiosity, fear, and suspicion. Prefect Valerius stood on the steps of the town hall, flanked by his guards. He was a picture of polished authority. Magistrate Vance stood beside him, her expression grim and unreadable. When Valerius saw them approach, a triumphant smile touched his lips. He let them walk to the center of the square before he began to speak, his voice carrying easily over the hushed crowd. "Citizens of this fine town," he began, his tone reasonable and concerned. "I am Prefect Valerius. I have come here on a simple matter of law. This orc," he said, pointing a manicured finger at Graka, "is my indentured servant. She fled my care, stealing valuable goods in the process, and has been hiding here, enjoying the misplaced charity of one of your own." He held up a scroll, its red seal gleaming. "I hold here a legally binding contract for 5 years of labor, signed by her own hand, or thumbprint, as it were. She is my property until her debt is paid, a debt she has only increased with her thievery and defiance. The crowd murmured. It sounded so official, so final. Graca flinched at the word property, the familiar shame washing over her. She could feel the town's opinion shifting against her, a cold tide of prejudice. Silas stood motionless beside her, a silent, solid presence. Valerius continued, his voice dripping with false magnanimity. I am a reasonable man. I do not wish to cause a disruption. Simply return what is mine, and I will take my leave. This man, Silas, can consider himself fortunate I do not press charges for harboring a fugitive. He looked expectantly at Magistrate Vance. The old woman stepped forward, her gaze sweeping over the crowd before landing on Graca. The prefect has presented his claim, she said, her voice clear and sharp. Now the accused will have a chance to speak. All eyes turned to Graca. She felt 100 pairs of human eyes on her, judging her, fearing her. Her throat went dry. The words wouldn't come. She saw Valerius's smug smile and felt a wave of despair. He was winning. Then she felt a small hand slip into hers. It was Zor. He looked up at her, his expression unwavering. On her other side, Lyri squeezed her hand tightly. She looked at Silas, who gave her a single, almost imperceptible nod. Speak the truth. She took a deep breath, and she began to speak. Her voice was low at first, but it grew stronger with every word. My name is Graca, she said, her eyes not on Valerius, but on the faces in the crowd. The baker, the blacksmith, the woman who ran the provisioner's store. My mate was killed. I came to the prefect's town looking for work. I have 2 children to feed. She held up her hands. These hands know work. I am not afraid of it. The prefect offered me a bond. He said it was to pay for food. I signed. I worked. But the debt never shrank. It only grew. He charged me for the air my children breathed. He charged me for the rags they slept on. Valerius scoffed loudly. Lies and fabrications from a desperate... I am not finished, Graca said, her voice ringing with a new authority. She looked directly at Valerius now, and he faltered, surprised by her sudden fire. You never called me by my name, she said, her voice dropping, becoming more personal, more damning. To you I was the Orc. You praised my strength in the public square so all the humans could see your great generosity in managing such a beast. You told me my son, who is 8 years old, would be sent to the mines. You told me this was the only way to pay my debt. You tried to take my children. That is why I ran. I did not steal anything from you. I took my children, who were not property. They are my life. A new voice cut through the silence. She speaks the truth. It was the town healer, a quiet woman named Anya. She pushed her way to the front of the crowd. When Silas brought her here, I was asked to check on the children. They were malnourished. The girl had a fever. They were wearing rags in the cold. Whatever care the prefect was providing, it was not enough to keep a child healthy. The crowd began to murmur again, But this time the tone was different. They were looking at Valerius, at his fine clothes and his well-fed guards, and then at Graca and her children. They were looking at his documents, and then at her truth. Valerius's face flushed with anger. His mask of civility was cracking. "This is absurd. An emotional appeal from a common criminal and a village hedge witch. The law is the law. The contract is signed." "Indeed it is," Magistrate Vance said, stepping forward again. She held up a book. "And our town charter, which predates your prefectural authority, is also law. It states that any indenture contract that cannot be reasonably paid off within 2 years through standard labour is considered predatory and is therefore null and void." She looked at the ledger Silas had brought, which she held in her other hand. "According to this and the standard wages for logging, Graca has already worked off more than half of her supposed 3-mark debt in a single month. Your 5-year contract, Prefect, is illegal here. It is, by our laws, an instrument of slavery." The word hung in the air. Slavery. It was an ugly word, a word that stripped away all of Valerius's legal posturing and left only his greed and cruelty exposed. Valerius was sputtering now, his face a mask of fury. "This is an outrage, an insult to my office. I will have you all." "You will do nothing, Prefect," the magistrate said, her voice like ice. "You have no authority here. Your contract is void. Graca and her children are free citizens under the protection of this town." She turned to the crowd. "Is that not so?" A low rumble of assent went through the crowd. The blacksmith, a large man with soot-stained arms, took a step forward. Then the baker. Then others. They weren't a mob. They were neighbours. They formed a quiet, solid wall between the family and the prefect. Valerius looked at the silent, unmoving faces. He saw that he had lost. His authority, built on paper and performance, had crumbled in the face of a simple truth spoken plainly. His face contorted in a final, hateful sneer. He turned without another word, mounted his horse, and rode out of the square, his guards scrambling to follow. He did not look back. It was, perhaps, the only honest gesture he had made all day. As he disappeared, a quiet cheer went through the crowd. People came forward, clapping Silas on the back, offering a kind word to Graca. The woman from the provisioner's store pressed a bag of fresh apples into Liry's hands. The fear had broken, washed away by a current of shared decency. Graca stood in the middle of it all, her children safe at her side, and felt the weight of 100 chains falling away. She was free. They walked home as the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the snow. The air was still and cold, but the world felt new, reborn. When they reached the cabin, the light from the windows spilled out onto the path, a welcoming beacon. Inside, the fire was burning brightly. It felt different now, not just a shelter from the world, but a sanctuary they had earned, a home they had fought for. Graca looked around the familiar room, at the table where they shared their meals, at the hearth where her children slept, at the man who had stood beside her. Over the next few days, a quiet sense of peace settled deep into the foundations of the cabin. The threat was gone. The future was no longer a terrifying unknown, but a blank page waiting to be written. One afternoon, Silas was sitting by the fire, putting the finishing touches on his carving of the wolf. Zor sat on the floor nearby, working on his own small carving. The lopsided fish was slowly starting to resemble a bird. Silas looked over at the empty rocking chair, at the shawl Ilara had made, its colours faded from years of sun. For so long it had been a shrine to his grief, a space he kept empty out of loyalty to a memory. But his memory of Ilara wasn't in the chair. It was in his hands, in the way he knew how to mend a roof, in the gentle way he spoke to the children. It was a part of him, a deep root that had nourished him even in his loneliest years. He looked at Graca, who was quietly singing to Liri as she braided the little girl's hair. It was a low, resonant melody, an old orcish lullaby. It was the first time he had heard her sing. The sound filled the cabin, a beautiful, powerful current of life that wrapped around the quiet grief and made the whole room feel warmer. He realized then what he had been feeling for weeks. Some things don't heal by being forgotten, but by making room for what grows beside them. His grief for Ilara wasn't gone. It had simply made room for something new. For Graca, for the children, for this strange, unexpected, beautiful family. He got up and went to the small stool that Zor used for his lessons. He picked it up and placed it on the hearth, right beside the empty rocking chair. It didn't replace the chair. It didn't crowd it. It just sat beside it. A new piece of furniture in a home that was growing. Graca stopped singing and watched him. She understood the gesture perfectly. He was making room. He walked over to her. He didn't have any grand words. That wasn't his way. He just stood before her, his hands open at his sides. "I would be honored," he said, his voice quiet but clear, "if you and the children would stay, not as workers, not as guests, as family." It wasn't a proposal of passion, but of partnership. It was a promise of shared winters, of stacked firewood, of a quiet life built together. It was everything she had ever wanted. She looked at her children, her bright, resilient Liri, and her steady, brave Zor. She looked at this good, quiet man and the home they had already built. A true, wide smile spread across her face, lighting up her eyes. "We are home," she said. And she was. That evening, as the snow fell softly outside, the cabin was filled with the sound of her singing, a song of resilience, of new beginnings. The song of a voice, long silenced, finally reclaimed. The roots of the old tree and the sapling were growing together, intertwined in the rich soil of a home that had learned that the heart does not heal by replacing what was lost, but by making room for what has been found.